let's dive into our text. We're looking at Colossians chapter 3, verse 1. And let me build us up to where we are. Paul has celebrated already in this letter the superiority of Christ because he's concerned that the believers in Colossae might be led away by deceptive philosophy, he calls it. And as we get into it, it's a little hard to figure out exactly what's going on, but apparently there is somebody or some people that are telling them that there's a certain way to do this Christian thing, and it deals with not touching or tasting or handling certain things. And largely in verse 23, which you can see on the text here, he'll say, Paul says, such regulations that these folks are offering indeed have an appearance of wisdom. With their self-imposed worship, their false humility, and their harsh treatment of the body. And so you get a sense of what they're offering as kind of a, I don't know, yoga for Jesus, who knows what it is. But Paul ultimately says, but they lack these things, this whatever self-imposed worship is, false humility. Listen, scholars struggle with what it is. I don't know that we have to figure out what it is in order to go into chapter 3 to say, it's basically, we don't have to figure out what Paul says not to do in order to figure out what Paul says to do. So I think we're going to be safe in reading the letter in the whole, but anyway, but notice he mentions here that they lack any value in restraining sensual indulgence. And what he means by that is all of these external practices will not necessarily make you a better person. Yeah. And so I don't think he's trying to put a damper on things like fasting and prayer and things that require discipline. But sometimes our spiritual disciplines can become more important than the Jesus we're trying to be in touch with. I think that's really kind of the big picture here. And so Paul makes a transition in chapter 3:1, and I won't necessarily map this out, unless we need to see something, because I think it kind of stands out there. Since then, you have been raised with Christ. By the way, Paul's already touched on the notion of baptism being sort of like circumcision, in which God raised Jesus from the dead. So we've had some of this language already in Colossians. Since then, you've been raised with Christ. And by the way, I do think he's probably referencing baptism as the moment, but I also think Paul's more interested in the life of the Spirit than the life in the water. But he's probably referencing the moment in time that they could point to as their baptism. So, but nonetheless, he says, since you've been raised with Christ, since this is true, set your hearts on things above where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. And so he's saying, if we've been raised from the dead, then we ought to set our mind on where Jesus is already. Set your mind on things above, which, by the way, is simply a repetition of set your mind on, or your hearts on things above, not on earthly things. For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you will also appear with him in glory. Now, what I want you to notice here is this language very familiar to us, this text you've heard before. But the contrast is between the false way of trying to get to God through all these rituals and the true way of getting to God. You see that? So it's not, even this comment about seeking things above is not in isolation to the larger text. So I think the next paragraphs are going to begin to spare, verse 5 and following will begin to spell out what's meant by this, where things are above. But Ed, I don't know if you've picked up on it. What's the mystery? The mystery earlier in Colossians? Christ in you?
Yes.
Notice how that gets played out here again.
Okay.
Although now it's kind of flipped. It's said the other way. Your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, and notice this really interesting phrase here, when Christ, who is your life, the very essence of life, appears, I think it's talking about what we would normally call the second coming, you will also appear with him in glory. But Paul makes a point here that there is a decisive turning point in our life in which we were dead, but we're now alive. In fact, he's going to make it even more pointedly, for you died. There is a decisive moment in our spiritual lives. And by the way, spiritual in Paul usually means more real than less real. When we say the word spiritual, we usually mean less real. So there's a decisive moment in which we, as believers in Jesus, have died, and our life is now totally consumed in the life of Jesus. As I've said this, and it's probably simplistic, but there is a sense in which when God sees us, he sees Jesus. And I think this is one of the texts that kind of says that kind of thing, is that when Christ, who is our life, appears, then we also show up. And so one of the rhythms of the New Testament is that what happens to the Messiah also happens to the Messiah's people.
Well, that goes along with that, with the understanding of the sharing in the suffering.
Yes.
We spend a great deal of time. We can spend a great deal of time being grateful that Jesus came as the Messiah and experienced what we experienced. You know, he knows what betrayal is. He knows what,
sure,
all of those things. But there, it is, to me, that's another way of saying that when God the Father sees Christ, he sees us, or when he sees us, he should see Christ.
Yeah, I think there's a truth to that. In 1 John, I think it's chapter 3, it talks about that when Jesus appears, we will see him as he is because we will be like him.
Right. And
so you get those kind of for me, they're almost teaser lines. I want to know so much more.
Yeah.
So, yeah. But what I do want you to see when you're reading Colossians, that the since then actually creates, Paul is saying in some sense, the way we do it is not this way, but this way. Did you follow my logic there?
Yeah.
Yeah, not this way, the way the deceptive philosophers are teaching you, but we do it this way. And I really think that these early lines in chapter 3 are kind of header lines in that they set up the topic. And then the next lines, I would indent this under as being supportive material to now explain what he said. Put to death. Obviously, notice how it ties with verse 3, for you died.
Yeah.
So put to death whatever belongs to your earthly nature. And notice how that's a play on the lower things as opposed to the higher things. Yeah. So the contrast is between where Jesus is versus earthly things. And then he lists, he begins to get very explicit about what does this earthly kind of living look like? Well, it involves sexual immorality, a Greek word that means kind of the broad range of sexual misbehaviors. Impurity. Not necessarily, when we think morality in the Western culture, we nearly always think sexuality in the main. Morality involves how we live life together. And so it's broader than that. So impurity here is not just sexual impurity, it's doing impure thoughts, it's treating somebody as if they're impure. I mean, it's a wide range of behaviors. Lust, epithumia, evil desires, and I'm all good with this other list. I think God and I have taken care of that. And then he has to go and say greed. Does he have to put greed up there with all of those things? But when we think of morality in Western culture, we don't always include greed in our thinking. But Paul is saying that these are the earthly things. And by the way, he's not trying to be exhaustive. So don't think he's just he's given us some samples to say, here's what I'm talking about. And I don't know, and I really do think, I think the right way to read which is idolatry is it's describing greed. Although really it could describe all of the other things as well. Yeah,
Right.
you could read,
Sorry, when you say impurity and evil desires, a word that comes to my mind is deceit, hypocrisy.
Well, remember that earlier in this letter, it was, don't be taken by deceptive philosophy.
Exactly.
Yeah. And verse 6 is kind of easy to outline because the because there really helps you. Because of these, the wrath of God is coming. A fairly unpopular theme today, as you may have noticed in the world. That God, in fact, will come to make things right one day. In fact, that's the good news of the gospel at the cosmic level, is that somehow God's going to make everything right. Wrath is coming. And that's all Paul says about that. And then, sorry, let me put a page break there so that I can keep the text together so for us to see it. He's still talking about these things. You used to walk in these ways in the life you once lived. Well, that kind of makes it personal. Not only are you to put these things off, you used to live this way. And so I was in a Bible class one time where a young lady made the observation that we don't really want to put these things to death. We just want to hurt them a little bit, just wound them a little bit, not put them to death. And I've always remembered that remark as being, that's right on the money, isn't it?
Yeah.
You used to walk in these ways, but notice we've got a contrast there that I think helps us here. But you must also rid yourself of all such things as these. And now the list continues. Oh, anger. I don't know about you, but I find that one a little closer to home than some of the others. Anger, rage, malice, slander. Anger, rage, malice is like anger. Now, I realize it's got different flavors and such, but it's basically saying, okay, some of the things that are going, and notice the language here is, since we've died to these things, we get rid of them. And one of the ways of thinking of the get rid language is that take it off like it's a piece of clothing. Take those things off. But notice the list here in anger, rage, malice, slander, and filthy language from your lips. Probably the common denominator, if there is one, between anger, rage, malice, slander, and filthy language is they're all things we express with our lips. Yeah. Not that you always have to do that, but anger tends to lead to us saying things we ought not to say. In fact, there's this great text in James, I think it's in James chapter 3, it says, human anger does not work the righteousness of God. How true that is. And by saying how true that is experientially in my life. Yeah. So what begins to happen here is that Paul begins to paint an alternative reality for how we live in the world by seeking things above. So this is how we live in the here and now. And so, again, staying with the notion of language. Do not lie to each other, since you have taken off your old self with its practices. Hear that clothing language? You've taken it off. And so do not lie to each other. Or sorry about that. Do not lie to each other. Again, I think this reason here is because we don't live that way anymore. Yeah, there's this great line. I don't know if you guys like the comic heroes, but in the most recent Spider-Man rendition, one of the lines that come out about doing good is that's because that's what we do. And I think Paul's doing that's what we do. Why do we love our enemies? Because that's what we do as believers in Jesus. So notice this really rich language here. You've taken off the old self with its practices and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator. So
I like the fact that Paul there, when you've taken off the old self and you've put on the new self, there is the process though in this, which is being renewed. It doesn't mean it was a one and done. Doesn't mean that, when you've taken off your old self and put on the new self, that you are now this perfect person. I'll use that word term, but I like that he's very clear that you are in the process of being renewed in knowledge in the image, because you have to know that it takes time to get to know Jesus.
That's right. It does. Listen, there are things that I didn't understand to be against the nature of God that I now believe is against the nature of God, because as I mature, I see things that I couldn't see before. And so that's part of the renewing process. Also, the language of renewal, and notice it's in the image of its creator, is that the process of becoming more like Jesus is in fact participating with God in creation. That the language that's so often used to talk about what we would call salvation, sanctification, is also language. The language that's used is like recreation language, like Genesis 1. God is still creating in us.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
But
I love that part. And just to speak to your point about that thing about that's what we do, Spider-Man.
Yes.
In family, when my kids would come and they'd say, well, we want to do this, I would just say, nope, that's not a Losi thing. That's our last name. Nope, no Losis, we don't participate.
That's right. Yeah. We don't do that. Yeah. And I think we need a recovery of that spirit within the life of the Christian church, which is there are things that it's not that we can't do them, it's that we've taken them off. They're not part of who we are anymore. Yeah. But notice that also these things are also very relational. They deal with how we treat other people, anger, malice, rage. And even the earlier thing, sexuality, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed. They also have a dimension that's larger than just individual sin.
Yeah.
And you begin to feel that a little bit in Paul's comment in verse 11. Here, and I think he means here in this new space of having taken off things, right? Here in this new space, there is no Gentile or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all and is in all. And again, notice how that links with the earlier language that when Christ, who is our life, will be revealed, we will be revealed, that we are in Christ. Christ is everything. And again, it ties back to the first chapter that Christ is enough. Jesus really is enough. I'd love to tell you why Paul picked these particular categories, because I know in other places he picks other categories. But here, Jew and Gentile, that's one of his big categories, because his whole ministry is built around the notion of Jews and Gentiles being in fellowship. Circumcised and uncircumcised is basically another way to say what he just said. Barbarian and Scythians, he's really stretching it here, because he's talking about the folks the Romans don't want anywhere near you, because they're by the way, you may know that barbarians is a Greek word that comes from the fact that they couldn't be understood, and the Greeks would always say that they talk barbarians, barbar. Yeah. And Scythians are basically the worst kind of barbarians. So instead of saying, civilized versus barbarian, he just kind of leans into barbarian, Scythian. Yeah.
So I don't know anything about Scythian. Is that like a group?
Yeah, it's a people group, and it's It's for Paul in Paul's day, it's some of the wildest of the wild people out on the edge of the frontier. Yeah, Karen, you got some information on the Scythians? You're muted.
Now can you hear me?
Yeah, we got you, Karen.
I have information on the barbarians.
Yeah.
I've got a note that they drank the blood of their enemy. They used the scalp for a napkin and the skull for a bowl.
Yeah, that's who these folks were. Yeah, yeah. Even those folks can come to Jesus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And don't think yourself any better than they are.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah. And so Paul is painting a pretty radical picture of not only new creation, but new community.
Well, that makes good sense in what we learned before, but like you said about the Gentile and the Jew, they were two separate, I'll use the word congregations. Right? Like really, they did not spend time together. I don't know enough about the Gentile life yet to say,
Yeah.
did they do business together? Like, for example, you might buy something at the marketplace from a Gentile, but maybe not. I don't know.
Yeah, there's certainly mixing, but there's also a very conscious, let's not have any more dealings with those folks than we absolutely have to.
Right. Well, so they could go to the synagogue, but they had to be outside in their own court.
Well, with the temple, that's true. Yeah. Yeah. So they do intermingle, at least at some levels, but they're also very clear. Paul's very clear that from a Jewish perspective, you shouldn't have dinner with a Gentile.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Jump in there, Karen.
What? No, question. You clarified at the temple, the Gentiles had their own court. What was the situation by the time of the synagogue?
Well, the synagogue actually seemed to have had room, at least according to the book of Acts, for God-fearers to overhear. And so I don't know if they're outside the synagogue or if there's a special place for them to sit in the synagogue. But I'm pretty certain they didn't sit mixed in with the Jewish congregation. Yeah, I'm pretty certain that's true. Yeah, but the synagogue had a group of folks that Luke calls God-fearers, who are those who find themselves, they're not full converts. By the way, once you're a convert to Judaism, you're considered a Jew, even if you're a Gentile. Right. And by the way, the Romans probably considered you a Jew as well. But if you're in that quasi state where you've not accepted circumcision, then you're probably in a place of overhearing what's going on in the synagogue. Yeah.
Another question.
Sure.
In the synagogue where you had your Gentiles coming in.
Yeah.
I understand circumcision, but if you were a single lady, such as perhaps Lydia was, we don't know, how would she be fully taken in to the Jewish community?
I would imagine, by the way, there was, again, there's so much more we wish we knew, but one of the practices was self-baptism, is that you baptized yourself. And so there was actually a ceremonial occasion at which one identified with the Jewish people. So, yeah, I don't know how they kept that clear. I don't know. I don't mean to be crude here, but I don't know how they checked the men at the door to make sure they were legit.
Yeah.
Apparently they did.
Apparently they were certain. Yeah. Apparently there was a way. Yeah. So let me move us into the next verse. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved. By the way, I love those three things together as identifying very much up front who we are as God's people. But notice we don't get the verb until here. And so I would probably indent this one just a little, so that as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, By the way, chosen people is the language of Judaism, God's people. Holy, of course, set apart for God, and dearly loved is the typical word agape, right? Clothe yourself. And notice how this is continuing the language of having put on the new self. And so Paul continues to play this language of putting on and putting off. And so here are the things that you are to put on and put off, or to put on. Let's clothe yourself with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. I find that even when I read these terms up against the earlier terms of sexual immorality and rage and anger, that there's a world of difference between we're not like this, we are like this. This is how we, and by the way, these are the traits of the faith that we sometimes minimize, particularly in our churches where believing the right thing tends to weigh more than doing the right things. And here orthopraxy is the famous, orthodoxy is what we think, orthopraxy is what we practice. If we're doing this Jesus thing well, we become people who are compassionate and kind and humble and gentle and patient. So if I were to walk along a church and say, okay, how do you know you're getting the job done? Well, are your people compassionate, kind, humble, gentle, and patient? And of course, we easily identify these in another context as similar to the fruit of the Spirit, but it's really easy to say, well, that's kind of what Jesus looked like. So he goes on to, yeah, go ahead.
About 30 years ago, my uncle was one of 5 men appointed as elders. And as part of their team building, they took some personality tests and whatnot to understand their interactions and how they work together well. And they were quite floored when all 5 of them were judged to be effeminate. And finally, they realized that this verse was probably characteristics that are judged by the world to be softer and gentler and more typically effeminate.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we've got a really distorted sense of what masculine and feminine means, at least in Christian terms.
Yeah.
Because all of us should be hoping to become more like these traits.
I just finished a course called Grasping God's Word with Billy McMillan, and
did you survive that course?
Barely.
Okay, yeah, Billy's tough, isn't he?
Well, he's an excellent professor. He's an excellent, like he really is, and I appreciate.
Well, I promise you, I will not tell him that.
Well, I have, but I had, no, it's been a big learning, but one of the things that I came across that's in Paul's writings, it was in Ephesians at the end of chapter 4, the last verse, whatever that is, 31, 32.
Yeah.
But he talks, and it kind of goes into the beginning of 5, where it's the beginning of 5 is be imitators of God, but the verse at the end of 4 is, be kind, compassionate, and forgive.
Yes.
And then be imitators. And what I feel I learned in that is when I forgive and I want to know if I have forgiven, then I should be able to go up and say, be compassionate and kind to that person.
Yeah.
It has, it's the way Jesus does that is he shows his compassion and kindness either way. But for me, in my process of forgiving, I needed to do that. And what I see here is the same thing. If I was looking at being the kind of person that Jesus in me saying, and as it relates to forgiveness, that compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, those are all things that you would see in the act of forgiveness. It would be the manifestations of forgiveness.
Yes.
Not phony, not masks, not pretense,
Mm-hmm.
but actually, I just love the fact that it's compassion or tenderhearted first,
Yeah.
because that speaks to what you said. These are things of the heart, of the soul, of the inner being.
Yeah, I would argue that these are more deeply human traits than sexual immorality and the other things, right? And so in some sense, the new humanity is more human, or what humans are intended to be, right?
Yeah.
Bear with each other and forgive each other. If any of you has a grievance against someone. By the way, this is harder work in church life than you can imagine. But I love the next line: forgive as the Lord forgave you. And then when you just do a quick assessment, so God, I deserve to be forgiven. That's why God forgave me. Just do a little self-assessment around that text, and you're going, no, that's not how this worked. Jesus forgave us freely.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
I just want to say, in that forgiveness journey, he forgave, and as it relates to our sin and to heaven, but there are still consequences of sin here on earth.
Sure. I'm not sure we're the imposers of the consequences, though.
No, we're not. No, we're not.
But there are some, again, there are built-in penalties in the things we do. And that's why I love working with post-high school folks, because I know that in those 4 years from 18 to say 22 to 25, that they can make decisions that will change the course of their life for good or ill.
Yeah.
Now there's other moments too, but
actually, the verse 12 and 13, the list there, it appeared in Galatians 5:22, the fruit of the Spirit. Quite
it does. Yes. It at least parallels those items, right? Yeah. And over all these virtues, put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. And in some ways, Paul is the apostle of love, saying that the ultimate thing that God is doing with us is he's loving us, and he's wanting us to become loving people like he is loving. So
is that the agape love?
Yeah, it's agape. Yeah. Yeah, but for Paul in another place will say that the greatest of these is love. Remember, so the love of God might well be the theme of Paul's writings in some ways. Although I know he talks about lots of things, but he always brings this back to putting love on top of everything we are. And so in the next line, I think he's continuing his admonition, but I don't know whether to indent this or to leave it to the left, but let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body, you were called to peace. Notice how well that fits unity as the last word in verse 14. Peace and unity are pretty closely related, right?
Yeah.
And be thankful. Let the message of Christ dwell among you. It could be in you as in inside you, but I think among you, when you were dealing with a group of people, is probably the right way to translate it. Let the message of Christ dwell among you richly as you teach and admonish one another with all wisdom through psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit. Spiritual songs is the way it used to be translated. Singing to God with gratitude in your hearts. This text, while often used as a kind of, this is a worship context, Paul's context remains all the way throughout this text. This is how we live life together.
By the way, don't you think it's interesting, because I've been learning from you and ABC about this blocking paragraphs, that you could, under the word, to teach and admonish. And what are we admonishing with? Psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit.
Yeah.
Singing to God in gratitude. That's
Yeah.
a whole different thing than you need to not attend because you have an earring in your left ear or whatever.
And notice that we do it with all wisdom. And I don't know that we're often aware that the wisdom of God is being spoken through us when we sing to one another.
Yeah.
By the way, I grew up in churches where spontaneous singing was not just it wasn't something that was limited to the worship assembly. It was actually something we might actually do together. I'd love to see Christians practice that more often. People together, singing together to one another. But again, this notion is that what the text is describing is what this new life in Jesus looks like. It should look like this. We know that in verse 17 because he says, and whatever you do, whether in word or deed,
Do all
in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. And so Paul is still painting in verses 15 and following, what does this put on new life look like? What does it feel like? How do we experience it? How do we express it? Ed, you got something there? I just noticed, or you just breathed and it switched to you.
Yeah, no, I think I just coughed.
All right, that's all it takes if your mic is on for the screen to go to you. So I want to suggest to you that what we have here is I do have a sermon that I preach on this text, and basically I said Christ brings us into a new orientation, a new community, and a new way of living. That's where Paul. That's kind of my sermonic way of summarizing it. And so remember that in the context of Colossians, he's saying, don't let the deceptive philosophers get you. This is what life in Jesus looks like. And let me also underscore that while we come at this, the Bible tells us to live this way. That's not how Paul comes about it. Paul comes about it this way. We live like this because this is the way it is in Jesus. Yeah. Now, I'm not wanting to separate the Bible from Jesus, but I want to say that the foundation, why do we live this way? Because it's the way Jesus taught us to live. Now, obviously, the Bible's a major conduit to get to that, but notice, by the way, one of the things I love to do when I'm teaching this is have people go back through the text and underline the number of times Christ, God, and the Holy Spirit is mentioned. And you'll actually be amazed because what we tend to hear is the do's and don'ts. Live this way, don't live that way. But notice how soaked this is in the nature of Christ. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And we can even count the pronouns. Notice how thick it is with theological language. This is the way it is in Jesus. This is the way it is in God. And you'll find that largely throughout the whole text. Do not lie to each other. Put on the new self, which is being renewed in the knowledge of the image of its creator. And so, stealing language from Spider-Man, again, this is what we do. So we do it because it's rooted in Jesus. Yes.
I was going to say too that it's not that it's just how we do it because Jesus said to do it.
Yes,
but
it's deeper than that.
It's also the best way to live. It's the way that results in the most good for the most people.
Yeah, I think all of that's true, but I want to push you a little bit deeper in the sense of saying it. We live this way because it is Jesus' way. It is his way. And his way is in us, and we are in him. We are hidden in him. And so the language of union with Christ is much deeper in this text than it's not just imitating Christ, it's actually being in Christ. Yeah. But what you said, Ed, is absolutely true.
It made me think a little bit of the Beatitudes, blessed be you. I mean, it is a blessing to live this way.
Yes. And we are a blessing when we live this way. Yeah, very good. I want to show you that the household codes that follow, which are pretty typical in the ancient world And we tend to struggle with them with lots of pressures on our society for men and women to be certain ways. But what Paul is continuing here is he's taking something they're very familiar with. These household codes are very common in Greco-Roman writing. So Paul's not inventing the structures of wives and husbands being instructor. But what he is doing, guys, is he's throwing in a critical twist that we don't hear often as well as we do. And let me see if I can do my best to bring it out. Wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. By the way, notice there's a little bit of a condition there, as is fitting to the Lord. This language tends to be read in a negative light today, but I'm not sure up until more modern times, that's how folks generally read this text. By the way, nobody in the ancient world would have argued with Paul's wives, submit to your husbands. Everybody expected that in culture. As is fitting in the Lord gives the wives a little bit of room of discerning that certain things might not be best for the Lord. But it's the next line, husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. In ancient Roman culture, the wife was largely still property and nobody cared. Listen, the law would not intervene if you killed her. And so Paul is actually introducing into his world some radical shifts. And so while Paul never uses the language of mutual submission, that is, he'll say wives submit to the husband. He'll not say husbands ought to submit to their wives, but in a way he still does. And he creates a model of mutual care for each other.
Dan, doesn't he say that in the Ephesian letter?
He does. In fact, it's fuller there. What's interesting about the Colossians, the letter to the Colossians is a bit of a younger stepbrother to Ephesians. It's also very short and curt in things that Paul spells out a bit more in Ephesians. Okay, let me do the next line and see if you can feel the reciprocal care. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Obey your parents would have been accepted by everybody. Fathers, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged. I can assure you that at least the elite in the ancient world did not care if they discouraged their children. Again, that's kind of the new twist to how we do this mutual care together. Fathers are still fathers and children are still children, but there's a way to mutually care for each other. And now, even though Paul has said there's neither slave nor free, he addresses slaves here. Slaves, obey your earthly master in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you and to curry their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ who you are serving. Anyone who does wrong will be repaid for their wrongs, and there is no favoritism, which seems to be a line that's kind of addressed at masters. Next. Masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you have a master in heaven. Again, in the ancient world, slaves were property and you could do as you wish. So even in this institution, this is how we do it in the name of Jesus. So even if we are in unequal relationships in our social arrangements, there's a way to treat one another.
Yeah.
The college president and the college janitor deserves the equal amount of respect.
And dignity.
And dignity, yeah. And sometimes the president of this college is mopping floors with the janitor. And
you know what? You're so true when you say that about yourself, Dr. Halton, because I wanted to say when I read that, that's the first thing I thought of. Like, working with you on many projects the last couple of years and working with some of the team at the college there, I always comment on the difference. Like, I've never worked in a Christian environment before Alberta Bible College, and it is just such a calm and a peace. The contrast is just, and so anyway, I just want to say you're so right, and you do treat all of your staff like that, and I think it's just a feeling that, no, it's true though, and all the co-workers treat each other like that too. It's definitely a Christian environment.
Let's do, hang on, let's see, where are we? Let's do the next verses, because we'll return next week and we'll deal with Tychicus will tell you all the news about me, where you're going, gee, I wanted more information and Tychicus got it and he's dead now. But anyway, let's Paul ends this section, this very large section on how we live life together as new creation, right? He ends it, devote yourself to prayer, being watchful and thankful, language he's used before, and pray for us too, that God may open a door for our message so that we may proclaim the mystery of Christ, again, going back to an earlier part of the letter, for which I am in chains. I pray that I may proclaim it clearly as I should. Be wise in the way you act towards outsiders. Now we're kind of stretching beyond just the community of faith. Make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. And that's where he wants to end the letter. Again, we've got final stuff that we're going to look at next week, and we'll talk about a little bit of historical background for Colossians, which, by the way, there's some really interesting information in the following verses.
I like the ending there, where he's very careful after being, encouraging community, and then it's, and we'll use the term right living or Christian living, Christ-like living, to devote yourself to prayer and being watchful and thankful, has to do with that. I want to use the word, the motivating impetus, right? Like when we think about being humble, I'll just think of that one, or what sometimes I am reminded that Jesus was not a wimp, and he did leave a situation. He didn't address everything, right? And so sometimes in our watchfulness, in our community, I think that sometimes Christians need to exercise restraint.
Well, again, notice here that as Paul talks about proclaiming and he asks us to pray for him, he's also reminding us that there's a particular posture we ought to take towards those who don't believe yet, which is be wise in the way you act towards outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity.
Yeah.
Let your conversation be full of grace.
Yeah. And in community, we need that as well.
We do need it in community, but also in learning how to live with one another, it's how we begin to treat outsiders, where they get a chance to experience something qualitatively different.
Yeah.
But Paul spends most of his energy here trying to help the Christian community live internally.
Right.
And then at the end here, he basically says, what you've learned how to do among yourself, do with others outside. But he's also telling us to be very careful, be watchful, be mindful. Let your conversation always be full of grace. I'm going to have to quit posting on Facebook if I'm going to do that, right? Seasoned with salt, that is, make sure it's flavorful, it tastes good.
And it's preserving.
Yeah, but always full of grace. Notice that Paul believes that if you're working towards having your language full of grace, that you will know how to answer everyone. He doesn't give you the content. He assumes that if you're beginning to live this way, then it'll come to you. You'll have what you need.